Jonathan Pershing is a senior advisor to the State Department Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Change, or for Climate, excuse me, John Kerry. Previously, he served as the lead U.S. negotiator to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change under the Obama administration. He also served as the senior climate advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Energy. Other previous experiences include the Hewlett Foundation, World Resources Institute, and the International Energy Agency, as well as serving as the science advisor and deputy director of the Office of Global Change at the U.S. Department of State in the 1990s. Dr. Pershing holds a PhD in geology and geophysics and has published and lectured widely on climate and energy issues, including serving as a lead author, review editor, and contributor for reports of the Nobel Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Today, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Pershing, who will provide an overview of U.S. policy on climate, the accomplishments of the recent Leaders Summit on Climate, and the path forward in tackling the climate crisis and meeting the demands of science. He will make opening statements, and then I will return and open it up for question and answer. When we get to question and answer, if you could please also just state your name, outlet, and country for Dr. Pershing so he knows where his questions are coming from. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Pershing. Thank you.
Let me start off with just a few general remarks and kind of framing questions or framing thoughts for people as we move forward. One of the things that I think that all of us are aware of, but often gets lost in some of the conversation, is the urgency of the problem and the confidence that we have about the seriousness of it. And the reason I use the word confidence is that people often say that we're not certain, that perhaps it isn't as bad as all that. Maybe there's other information we haven't looked at yet. Maybe it's a natural set of events. And the answer is that it's not, and that the science is explicit and clear. And let me frame it in some ways that I think might help as you look with yourselves and your readers to understand this and your listeners to understand it. We are currently on a trajectory in the absence of people's policies and technologies, on a trajectory to see several degrees of warming. That's degrees centigrade. And that warming is a function of the kinds of things we do in our day-to-day living. It's how we use energy, it's how we grow our crops, it's the normal course of industrialization, which has provided substantial benefits, but at the same time has led to some real damages and some real costs and consequences. It doesn't sound like a very big temperature difference. For most of us, we live in places where that might be, not even very much in terms of a day to nighttime change. And so you look at this temperature and you say, what's a degree or two? But the reality is the last time the world had that kind of a significant change in temperature, huge areas were either under ice when it was colder or were covered by water when it was slightly warmer. These are massive shifts when you look at global averages. And it's happening at a rate that's faster than anything we've ever seen in geological history. It's moving very, very quickly, much faster than communities and people can adapt. And if you look at the consequences, we're seeing them today. We're seeing costs in terms of wildfires. And I came to this job most recently having lived in California. The California wildfires are extraordinary. They're killing enormous numbers of people. They're destroying communities. They're destroying habitat and wildlife. And they are mirrored by wildfires in Australia. And those are mirrored by wildfires in the steppes of Russia. And those are mirrored by wildfires in the Amazon, which we've almost never seen before. These are consequences of climate changing already, much less the increment that we're expecting over the next 20 to 30 years. And we look at the same kind of thing in terms of the intensity of storms. Typhoons of category 5 that used to never really exist are now not commonplace, but much more frequent. Consequences of things like zoonotic diseases that come as we both encroach on those wild areas, but also as the disease vectors move because the temperature has changed and the precipitation has changed. These are things that are leading to increase not only in things like malaria, but in things like the Zika virus. Those kinds of questions are fundamentally stressing a global community which is stressed for a lot of reasons already, and this is exacerbating all of those questions. So I look at that and I say, this is why we're working on it. We are looking at a future in which some parts of the world, a number of countries in the Middle East as an example, become too hot and humid where a human life is not sustainable out of doors without protection. And I don't mean protection from the sun and therefore being in the shade. No, I mean the combination of temperature and humidity is too hot for a person to cool him or herself without an air conditioner. That's extraordinary. We don't have places in the world that are like that. And by 2030 or 2050, to expect that to be a number of days per year means you cannot live outside in those places. And that's a remarkable shift. And if we look at the amount of global built infrastructure within a meter, 3 feet of sea level, and look at sea level rise, it's an untenable thing to imagine a meter or 2 or 3 meters of sea level rise. And yet that's in some of the projections and scenarios. So the rationale for action is incredibly powerful, and I think that's got to be framed. The second thing, which I think is often missed, is that people look at this change and say, well, it's not doable. You can't get there. And that also is something that's not true. We do know how to do this. We do know how to make the shifts and what's required. In some sense, the direction of travel is known. You have to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that come from energy primarily, but also from land use and forestry and from industrial activities. That's pretty clear. We know what we have to do. But we're increasingly also able to point to ways you can deliver those outcomes at relatively marginal costs. And certainly, if you look at the damages from climate and weigh those against the costs of action, the costs of actions are quite modest. The damages are very, very large. So in net, in balance, the world is much, much better served by taking these actions. But even at a specific level, we're seeing real progress. So for example, if we think about this as partly an energy problem and partly as a carbon-intensive energy problem, that's a combination of coal, oil, and gas used for power, for transportation, for industrial heat, and we have solutions for all of those. If we look at the power sector, in much of the world today, the price of a zero-emitting renewable energy alternative is cheaper than almost any fossil alternative. That's true in almost all cases for new construction, and it's increasingly true for existing infrastructure, where in fact, it would cost you less to build something new and operate it, a solar plant, a wind turbine, maybe sometimes run-of-river hydro, maybe geothermal. It would cost you less to build and run that new plant than to keep the old one running. That's a real shift. These are things that have happened because of a tenfold or greater decrease in price of solar and wind just in the last decade or two. That's changing the economic dynamics. We're also seeing in the transport sector some real alternatives. We've always known that things like mass transit really work well, particularly in high, dense city environments. And those are things that we need to do more of, and we're seeing cities around the world build that out. But we're increasingly finding ways to look at alternatives to gasoline vehicles, and where we haven't got an alternative, to radically improve efficiency. Those are things that can save consumers a great deal of money, as well as being opportunities to reduce environmental damages. And the damages are not just about climate. They're about air quality. They're about toxics. They're about the life cycle of maintaining systems and leading to better qualities of lives. If we look at countries in Asia, which have among the worst air quality in the world, some of the shifts that will benefit climate will also improve local air quality, will include local water quality. Those kinds of opportunities are ones that we now see. And we've got a series of analyses that give us pathways to this future and talk about where we have to go and how we succeed. So now what's the American administration doing? So the Biden team has been in for just over 3 months, almost 4 months now, and the framework had a couple of different pieces. The president announced early in his term, and certainly ran in part on this as a campaign platform, that he intended to really take seriously the climate agenda and to address it with a great deal of urgency. Among other things, he put the United States back into the Paris Agreement. We have begun to work on our own long-term strategy, and we held a summit of leaders from the world on the 22nd of April on Earth Day to really bring to the attention of the world our intent and to help catalyze what we thought could be additional actions globally. We announced our own new target at that meeting. We committed ourselves to a 50 to 52% reduction below 2005 levels by the year 2030. That's a significant increase from where we had been before. We are driving toward a commitment to get to net zero by 2050. We are driving towards actions that the president has put into executive orders that call for decarbonizing the US electricity system by 2035 by installing significant numbers of charging stations for electric vehicles, by putting in place building efficiency programs, and by putting resources to rebuild the American economy post-COVID and rebuild our infrastructure in ways that are low or zero carbon. That's a framework that's being a model that we think could be used, but we're in turn looking at others who are ahead of us. The UK has been working on this aggressively during the years that we were out with the Trump administration. They've moved forward. They've announced a more than 75% reduction by 2030. We've seen Europe collectively about where we are at about a 55% reduction by 2030. Some countries are looking at 2045 for zero. These are incredible numbers that we're seeing. We're seeing major new commitments that had been announced at the summit coming from around the world. Some places that you'd anticipate, places that have been leaders in this agenda for a long time, some of the leaders in Latin America, a Costa Rica, a Colombia really pushing forward. But we also saw from Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil a statement around his intent to work at zero and to reduce deforestation. We've seen commitments from Russia, which historically has not been very forward-leaning, really making some new announcements by President Putin. We've seen some statements from China about, at our summit, their intent to look at more stringent controls on coal and a phase down after 2025. These kinds of things are directionally correct. Can we implement them? How do we think about the rest of the world and where does it go? And part of what we have to do is think, what are the discrete tasks? Are we seeing that forthcoming? How do we finance it? Where is the technology capacity going to be built? What are the domestic policies that have to be developed in order to make that work? And how do we pull those pieces together? We think this is a seminal year. This is not a year like any other. We've just come out of COVID. We know that when the world seeks to do something ambitious and huge, it can. I'm not aware of any prior circumstance where a year after a pandemic, there is a vaccine, not yet adequately or widely enough available, but we actually created a vaccine from nothing in the span of a year and are beginning to get it out there. And countries have put literally trillions of dollars of assets into rebuilding their economies. We know how to do things at scale, and we've just demonstrated it. We have to apply that vision and that capacity to this problem, which is perhaps as existential, if not more so, for the global community. That opportunity presents itself this year in part because of a major meeting to be held in November in Glasgow in the UK. And the agenda at that meeting is to really recommit and reconfirm our intent to hold the global at below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and to make all efforts to get to 1.5 degrees. And as I began, even 1.5 degrees has damages, but above that, they're much worse. The costs are much higher. So our agenda, ours in the US, as we work domestically, ours as we work as part of a global community, ours in the global context is to try to solve that problem and do so with as much speed and efficacy as we can and not leave people behind. Because we should be clear, there is a transition here. And the transition can't afford to leave people out. It's a transition that can't leave people out in our country who are underserved and more vulnerable. It can't leave out those same communities around the world who did very little to contribute to the emissions surplus, but are going to be reap the difficulties of the change in climate, and who we need to be assisting and facilitating as they make their own transition to a low climate, low carbon impact world. Let me stop with that and look forward to the questions and the discussion. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pershing. Very interesting. Thank you so much. So our next question will go to one of the ones that was written in ahead of time. And forgive me if I mispronounce your name. It is Ange de la Victoire Dusa Bemungu, and he is from TOPAFRICANEWS.com in Rwanda. And the question is, the US is putting a lot of effort into tackling the effects of climate change. How do you plan to work with developing countries in that battle? Which priority areas will you be looking at as you renew your efforts in dealing with this issue?
So thank you for the question. There are a number of different pieces, some of which I alluded to in my opening remarks around the conversation, but I think they fall into two categories. There are really a number of developing countries which have substantial emissions. China still qualifies in that box. It's the world's largest emitter. India is in that category. It's the third largest emitter after the United States. So China's 1, the US is 2, and India is 3. These are both countries that really have significant capacity, but also really face some hurdles. For countries in those circumstances, and there are others also in the G20, we are looking really to figure out how to work with them to reduce emissions. In some cases, they don't need a lot of help. They need maybe some technical engagement. Maybe there's some financial relationships that you want to build out. So India, as a case in point, India has committed under Prime Minister Modi to install 450 gigawatts of renewable energy, primarily solar. But at the moment, they don't really have quite the wherewithal in a couple of dimensions. They're still trying to figure out how to raise the capital for that. They're trying to figure out, when they've got that much solar on their electricity grid, how do they ensure continued reliability? Because at night there isn't sun, and so how do you maintain the capacity to give people power 24 hours a day instead of just while the sun is shining? That kind of a structure is doable. We have battery technologies and backstop generation capacity and what they call spinning reserves. You can do it, but it requires some redevelopment and redesign. Can we help in those kinds of dimensions? There are many other countries that fall into that category, really are looking at making emissions reductions, but would like to find ways to engage both with the US and with others, both on the financing side and on the technical capacity side. At the other end, you have countries that are looking at that, certainly, because all countries are looking to reduce emissions, but their primary focus is how to adapt to the increasing problems of climate change itself. Changes in water, changes in the timing of the water. The monsoon shifts, and that changes crop availability and therefore food availability. Or you've got a sea level rise problem. I spent some time in Gabon not very long ago, and one of the conversations was coastal erosion up and down the Gabonese coast. That kind of a shift is real. Or I look at a country like South Africa and look at a place like Cape Town, which a couple of summers ago had one of its worst droughts and was looking at a reservoir that may not have any longer, it was within days of running dry, and the entire Cape Town community would have been without water. Those dynamics, that's no longer now about mitigation, that's about adaptation. How do I manage these increasing risks? How do I pick up the costs for infrastructure? What am I doing to allow my people to cope with the increasing frequency of natural disasters? Those are things like insurance programs that let you spread some of the risk out. The Caribbean nations have done some of that kind of work, but some of the African nations are also thinking about that. How do I think about structures of resilience? Part of it's about information. Do I have warning, advance information about this, about the impending disaster, so I can plan for it and get people out of harm's way? Can I put in some infrastructure that does a better job about distributing water? Can I make available cooling stations so when it's over a certain number of degrees Fahrenheit or Celsius, I can get people to safety? Can I manage food distribution networks so if I've got a problem with my crop, one year I'm not leading to starvation for my community? Those kinds of dynamics, those are things that we're working on. We're doing them both bilaterally through USAID, through Millennium Challenge Corporation, through the Development Finance Corporation. We've got a series of those bilateral mechanisms to provide financial assistance and technical assessments and support. And we're doing them with multilateral organizations like the World Bank and the African Development Bank and the regional development banks. But we're also trying to leverage private capital, because in our minds, it's not going to be sufficient to make it a public national government program only. You have to get the private sector involved. And that to me means two pieces. One, how do we from the US help generate that kind of an outcome? How do we stimulate that kind of an investment? But at the other end, how does the host country attract that kind of investment? What are the barriers to why the money is not flowing? And can we work with that country to help reduce the barriers so the money moves in more effectively to really build the infrastructure, to build the resilience, and to build the capacity to minimize emissions that could reduce the overall impact of the problem? So those are the kinds of things we're doing really in support of that agenda.